who many of you know died on Yom Kippur. And it's a long time now. It's 38 years. She died when she was 62 years old. And she fiercely loved her children. Those two terms, fiercely loved. She softly loved, but she was a fierce protector of her children. And Ima was a feminist before her time. And I think that a lot of who she was impacted my life and the lives of my siblings. And she had a certain purity and beauty. She actually was found in her room. My father had gone to services, and when he came back right after Yom Kippur, he said that her prayer book was open up to the service of atonement. And my father, his yahrzeit actually was a few months ago, but we're combining these classes, and he was a creative dynamo, independent thinker, an independent doer. He always operated from outside of the establishment and had an enormous influence on my life, as did my mother. And I have great memories of the Yomim Noraim when I was born when my father was 25 years old, 26 years old. And when I was 5 years old, I was already in my father's choir. And whatever synagogue skills I have from my father. I have memories of my mother urging me on. I think deep down she was wondering why my older sister Tova, who had a more beautiful voice than I had, that is for sure. I think my mother was wondering, I never heard her express it, how come Tova can't participate? And I have memories of standing near my father during the Avodah service. He was then 32, 33 years old, much younger, much younger than I am now. And I especially never understood the Avodah service, which is the holy service on the Day of Atonement. And my father's nusach was perfect. And I still remember his nusach. Vakohanim, da-da-dai, 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 v'ha'am. And he would fall to the ground. Vayukorim u'mishtachavim. It was a big scene. Everybody would come to pick him up, even though my father was so strong. I think he could have picked all those who were picking him up with one hand. And lately, I started learning the Daf Yomi. It's learning a folio of a page of Talmud a day. Something I thought I never had time to do during my rabbinate. But the truth of the matter is, I'm sure I could have found time, but I didn't. And we just finished a few months ago Tractate Yoma that deals with the service. And it's clear that most people don't understand that service. We know that we count achad, achad, v'yachad, one and one, fall to the ground 3 times. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to humbly study Gemara. In the beginning, it was with Rabbi Soloveitchik's Briska approach, then with Rabbi Feldblum, Dr. Feldblum's more historical approach. And then when I taught Talmud at Stern, it was more methodological. But as I grow older, I attempt to glean spiritual messages from the Talmud. And that's what I'd like to do now. Using the Avodah, this service, as a centerpiece, we're going to follow in the liturgy, the poetry of the liturgy, which on some level attempts to reenact the service of the high priest in the Holy Temple. And while the service is precise and meticulous, we'll try, as I pointed out, to lift spiritual ideas. Now, in the world of Orthodoxy, some may argue that spirituality and the meticulousness of Jewish law are antithetical. I think the reverse, that spirituality gives wings to Jewish law. And with that, I'd like to begin our study. I know that normally it's give and take, but here you'll have a chance to listen to a more frontal class, and I hope you find it of some meaning. It means so much to me that you found the time to join me in this study. And of course, I want to thank Rabbi Eric for being there with me and helping me. Without Eric, this year would not have seen the light of day. And I'm very grateful to you, Eric, for all of your help in preparing this presentation. And so in the Avodah, in the Musaf service, this is what the text says. And we're going to call this the Hachana, the preparation of the Kohen Gadol. And when we do the liturgy, Eric will be putting it up on the screen. Machazike Amana, Shavua Kodem Le'asor, Mafrishim Kohen Horosh, Kidot Hamiluim. Upholders of the faith, a week before the 10th, secluded the high priest, as was done in the days after the completion of the Mishkan. Now, if one looks at the beginning of the tractate Yoma, there is a very deep discussion as to whether these 7 days of the high priest ensconcing himself in one of the chambers, preparing for the Yom Kippur service, whether that parallels the 7 days of preparation of the high priest before the actual temple was dedicated, what's called the Miluim, or another opinion is it runs parallel to the 7 days of preparation before revelation itself. And when one looks at that, it could be a religio-legal dispute, but I'd like to see it in a more spiritual vein, that in the former, if it's parallel to the dedication of the temple, then the preparation has to do with our efforts in the sanctuary. If it's parallel to revelation, then it's more a matter of preparing ourselves to receive revelation. So if it's our preparation, we are the givers. And if you will, God is the receiver. If it's revelation, God is the revealer, and we are the receiver. And often when one learns the Talmud, one looks at both of these views, which seem opposite, and tries to understand them in dialectic, that they're balancing each other simultaneously. And so if one talks about God being the revealer and the other, we being the dedicator, maybe the human being and God are moving towards each other simultaneously. And the Talmud in Sukkah actually claims that we come closer and closer to God, as close as one can, but we do not touch. And in that liminal space, in that vacuum, that's the place where love is so intense, it transcends words. There is silence. Now, what I've just said is really, really a study that could take a complete hour in of itself. But my interest this morning is the following. To be sure, during the preparatory period, the Talmud talks about how the high priest was warned, be careful with the service. The high priest was purified. He had to go through the sprinkling of the red heifer. As a matter of fact, he ran through some trial run, through some practices to make sure he would do the Avodah carefully. But when one looks at this Bigadol on a more macro spiritual level, I think this 7-day period has a lot to do with creating a spiritual frame of mind. And this is in the spirit of the Talmud. The Talmud says that Hasidim Harishonim, the pious people, they used to wait an hour before they prayed. As a matter of fact, there is a popular Hebrew adage, Lifnei hatfilah ani mitpalel, shebizman hatfilah ani etpalel. Before I pray that when I pray, I'll pray. I like that. Before I pray that when I pray, I'll be able to pray. Rabbi Soloveitchik is quoted as saying, there's no holiness without preparation. And yes, that preparatory period of the Avodah is all of what the Talmud spoke about. But as we've just mentioned, I think the preparatory period should include deep spiritual meditation and silence. It's the silence of removing the clutter, the silence of deep inner thought and reflection. Silence, open your hearts, is not merely the absence of words, but is above words, transitioning from awestruck speechlessness to verbiage. Said beautifully by Dr. Michael Fishbane, my son Dove's mentor and Rebbe, who sponsored Dove's doctorate. Look at what he writes in his Spirit Sacred Attunement. There are two kinds of silence. One of these is natural silence and is characterized by the absence of noise. The other kind of silence is spiritual and is characterized by potentiality and anticipation. Anticipatory silence helps prepare the self to hear sounding. That's Dr. Fishbane. Helps people prepare to hear sounding. So before one could immerse the Kohen Gadol in this deep service, he needed this preparatory period. And it's something I think during these COVID days that we especially need. We need these moments. We need these moments of reflection. And I have deep memories of my mother, who didn't have an advanced education, but she loved Judaism. And I have memories of her sometimes just sitting and contemplating, kind of just preparing herself. And that is hachana, that is preparation. There is no kedusha without hachana. And so the service begins. But what's extraordinary about the service is that the high priest first engages not in the Yom Kippur service unique to that day, but he has to take care of what was done every day on a daily basis. Let's look at the poetry in the liturgy. The liturgy actually says, Toval, he immersed himself. Talk about preparation. He went to the mikveh, the ot zehavim. He put on golden garments. There were 8 vestments of golden garments that he wore during the day. And Omad, he rose, and then B'kidesh, he washed his hands and feet, and then he went into the courtyard, the keratz, or the kerates, and he made an incision to meet Hashacha of the daily morning service. I find this extraordinary. I find it extraordinary that here he's supposed to be focused. He's the main act. but he does the preliminary stuff. It's a little bit unusual. You would think that he should get to the service, which is unique to Yom Kippur, and if anything, it should precede the daily service. It is the most important. And yet that's not the case. And the Talmud talks about how he has to first take care of the service of the everyday. Now, I know when we talk about sacrificial services, people sometimes push back. I'd like to bracket that, and I'd like to cull spiritual, psychological messages from all of this. He has to take care of the morning standard offering, the daily incense. He cleans the candelabra, the menorah, the wicks. He pours libations. And I think the message is, and this is the spiritual message, that the daily service came before the more high-powered service of Yom Kippur, accentuating the importance of constancy, of being faithful to the typical day in and day out ritual. This is in consonance with the Jewish law, with halakha. Tadir ve'eno tadir, when a frequent and infrequent practice coincide, the frequent practice takes precedence. And here I'm really talking to myself and letting you listen. I just was not a rabbi of constancy. It was during the days, and today I just heard the great Ida Nudell passed away. Ida Nudell, some of you may know her name, a great, great Soviet Jewry heroine who hung outside of her balcony in Moscow a banner that said, "Let them go." It's one thing to lift the banner here in America, but to do so in Moscow, she really suffered. But she was a great, 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 great heroine. And it's certainly the case that on some level, at least for me, I found myself during those days of the Soviet Jewry movement. I think the motto of the synagogue, let's pray and let's go to a rally. Where's the rabbi? Well, he's in Austria, he's in Spain, he's being busted in this place and in that place. I always say, in Judaism, there's nothing wrong with being arrested. You just have to be arrested for the right reasons. So far, it's been for the right reasons. And you know who I used to have tremendous respect and awe for? I still do, Bernie Horowitz. He drove me nuts. Every day he was in synagogue, on time. He was Mr. Constancy. And that is a high level of sanctity. And I'm somewhat improved, but I've got a long, long way to go. The constancy, that's what counts. That's what counts most in love. Love is in the details. You know, at a ceremony under the chuppah, we read the marital document, the ketubah. And I actually read it to the cantillation of the Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, which I first heard done by Dr. David Eliach, may he be blessed with many years, husband of the late Mori Rabbi Yafa Eliach. And I read it with the romantic cantillation of the Song of Songs. Someone came up to me and said, "Avi, have you ever read the English of it?" I said, "Yeah, I understand the English." "Well, why don't you try reading it in the English?" And he promised her to give her a diary. And she promised, and he promised that they would feed each other, they would clothe each other. I mean, that is a love document. And the answer is, yeah. Love is in the details. Love is in the constancy. As a matter of fact, there's a difference of opinion in a midrash, in a rabbinic thought, which precedes the Ein Yaakov, which is a book on Agadah, where the rabbis are asking, what is the most important sentence in the Torah? And one rabbi says, I'll take it into English, What is the most important sentence? Shema Yisrael. The other rabbi says, what's the most important sentence? Love your neighbor as yourself. Shimon ben Pazi says, there's a more important sentence. Do you know what it is? The first lamb you shall sacrifice in the morning, and the second lamb you shall sacrifice in the evening. And Rabbi Ploni, which means Rabbi so-and-so, stood up and said, you know what? The law of halacha is like Ben Pazi. That's what counts the most. Day in, day out. I think these past 18 months, and hats off to Reb Stephen, and Reb Ezra, Rabbi Bracha, Rabbi Sarah, I think it's the finest hour of the Bayit. The finest hour. I think in my tenure, we had some fine moments, flashy moments when Sharansky came, when Kahana debated Dershowitz and all of that. But this is day in and day out. The love, the constancy. That's the real deal. That's the real deal. And so, we know this from the COVID days, that's what counts. He has to attend to the daily stuff before he gets to the Avodah. Moving along, there is a third piece after preparation and constancy. The third piece is precisely because the Kohen Gadol was reaching the highest of levels, he had to go into another chamber called the Parva in the temple, and he changed into white garments. He had golden garments and white garments. It's sort of lahavdil, like an actor or an actress on stage, and every few songs runs to the back to switch costumes. This on a much holier plane, I would think. Since he's moving now from the constancy, the daily service, he's about ready to perform the service which is unique to Yom Kippur. He has to change clothes. And he moves out of the 8 gold investments and he puts on white garments, 4 white garments. Let's look at it in the liturgy. The liturgy is fantastic. Hebrew is a much shorter language than English. Kidesh, the Kohen Gadol washed his hands and feet. Uforsha, then he took off his 8 golden garments. Pasa, he stepped into the mikveh. Vitaval, and immersed. Levanim at, put on 4 white garments, the Kidesh, and he washed his hands and feet. And when reading this, one wonders, why? Why, when performing this part of the service, does the Kohen Gadol wear fewer garments, not 8, but 4? And why are they white and not golden? This is the moment to wear the most glamorous clothes. Isn't the Yom Kippur service more grand, deserving of golden garments and the more numbered golden garments? And so a suggestion. Perhaps the white represents the need of the Kohen Gadol at the height of service to remain humble, precisely when the Kohen Gadol is center stage, facilitating atonement for the priests and all of the Jewish people, and maybe the world. It is important for him to dress in the more modest white color. And this is a concept which is found throughout halacha. For example, when we recite the Shmona Esrei, the major tefillah, the major service, the Talmud in Brachot says, Lamed Daled, we bow about 4 times in the service, 2 in the beginning, 2 at the end. And then the Talmud says, but the Kohen Gadol, for each blessing, for every blessing, each one of the 13 middle blessings, he's bowing. And one wonders why. And the great Rashi says, do you know why? The more lofty one's status, the more it is important to demonstrate subservience. I love that. Kol ma shehu gadol biotet tzarich lahachniya ulahashpil atzmo. You know, there is a piece in the Torah where the Torah says that the Kohen has the ability to make pure the impure, but in doing so, he himself becomes impure. And one wonders if the Kohen is the purifier of the impure, and he's doing so while he is pure, why does he become impure? And maybe it could be suggested that precisely when the Kohen, as he's purifying others, as the Kohen could feel a sense of haughtiness and brashness, it could go to his head. After all, he's got so much power. He can bring about purification. To counteract those feelings of arrogance, the Torah declares that the Kohen, the purifier, must himself become impure. Precisely when reaching the pinnacle of strength, the Kohen is reminded of self-limitation, knowing he too will soon become impure. Think about our leadership right here in America. When you hear somebody always gloating, always using first person singular, I did this, I did that, there's something wrong. Something wrong. As Rashi says, the higher your status, the more humble one should try to be. I love the passage in the Talmud which says, Bimakom an vitanuto, I'm paraphrasing, Bimakom gidulato sham an vitanuto, from Megillah 31. Wherever you see the greatness of God, you see his humility. And we, in the spirit of imitatio Dei, imitating the divine similarly, we should try. Precisely in greatness, there should be humility. Do you know who really knows something? The one whose ears are open to listen to the other. On the one hand, one who claims, I know, but what do I know? I'm open, I'm humbly open to others. And I can think of different models of people who do that. When I think of Dr. Eli Kranzler, who leads our service, the way he leads our tefillah, he's fully there. He's leading. He has a strength, but it's a strength with a very deep humility. Blessed is the father or mother who, as our children grow, says, I want to be like them. And I feel that way about our children, all of our children. Dovi, who is a great scholar, I can say that with great objectivity, he's so humble, he's driving me crazy. But what a beautiful trait. And when you're in the world of academia, that is not a place of great humility. He just carries himself with such anegut. It's something to think about. Knowledge is power. Academics is power. Power. Now, the military is power. The clergy is power. Careful, don't abuse that power. Stay humble. So it's not just like that the high priest wears the white and less of the white 4 garments rather than 8. It's purposeful. I'll go through another 2 and then we'll open it for a few minutes and then I'll finish the last 5. The next piece as we move along is what can be called self-judgment. After all, when we think about it, the high priest is there to basically speak to his fellow priests and to the people, urging them to purify themselves. And let's take a look at what happens. He is now in his white garments, paro mutzav, his ox stood. And again, my primary interest is to bracket the sacrificial service. We're trying to glean spiritual messages. Pogash v'samach yodo al rosho. He leaned his hands on its head. Psha'av hoda, and confessed his sins. V'kach haya omer, and this was his confession. Ona Hashem, please, O Lord, chatati, I have sinned inadvertently. Aviti, I've acted wickedly. I've acted purposefully, but for a certain material gain. Pashati, I've rebelled, I've sinned because I just want to defy you. I'm not receiving anything in return. Lefanecha. Anav Hashem, by your name, kaperna, atone for my sins and the sins of my household. And he is going to go on a second time to say, oh God, not at this moment, but a little bit later in the service, please atone not only for my sin, for my family, but for all of the priests. And then he's going to say, and then atone for all of the sins of the people. And he is moving from placing his hands on top of the ox near the sanctuary. He first asks for personal atonement for himself. And he does so, as we just mentioned 2 other times, before he will slaughter the bull. And he's going to ask for atonement as well for the people before sending the scapegoat. I know that this is all very complex. But my interest is in the movement. He first asks for atonement for himself, then for his fellow priests, and then for the people. And I think what this teaches is that before atoning for others, one must atone for oneself. The movement is from the inner to the outer. The Talmud says, "Kshot et atzmecha v'achar kshot acherim." Act properly before requiring others to do so. In other words, you can't facilitate atonement for others without self-atonement. An important principle of leadership emerges. Cleansing others begins by cleansing oneself. In the COVID era, you can't expect people to wear masks unless you're wearing a mask. In leadership, you can't be flying around on private jets as you become the person who is focused and centered on issues of the environment. When I think of my parents, I think of people who really did lead by example. Think of the Israeli army. Most of the officers in most armies are in the back of the troops. But in the Israeli army, the clarion call is Acharai, after me. And the leaders, the generals and the sergeants, they're in front of the troops. You can't, quote unquote, cleanse others unless one himself or herself is cleansed. I'll do one more and then open it up. This deals with the significance of the insignificant. So let me tell you what happens. Let's back up for a moment and summarize. He's in the white clothes and he has put his hand on the bowl, his hand, smicha. That was the original ordaining, smicha. And he would recite this atonement. Then, let's take a look at the text. He walked, the high priest then walked to the eastern side of the courtyard, where there stood a pair of goats, identical in color and height, ready to atone. 2 golden lots were mixed, one lot for God and the other for Azazel. He lifted the lottery, and there are many pages of Talmud on this. He shouted aloud a sin offering for the Lord. And the Talmud tells us that these goats were absolutely identical. They were identical in height. They were identical in measurement. Let's take a look at it. Shnei se'irei Yom HaKippurim mitzvatan sheyu shneim shavim b'mareh uvakoma uvadamim. That the mitzvah of the two Yom Kippur goats, one going to the heavens, one to Azazel, the goats sacrificed to God and the goats sent to Azazel that are brought as a pair, is as follows: that they will both be identical in appearance, in color, in height, and in monetary value. My teacher, whom I often quote, Reb Aaron Soloveitchik, suggests that on a spiritual level, the Lots ritual reminds us of this important message, spiritual message, that what appears to be insignificant can have significant ramifications. Because as we've noted, the goats were similar in appearance, height, size, and value. Yet a small shift of the high priest's hands brought about different destinies for the goat. Just a movement, a slight movement. Had he moved his hand another way, it would have been the opposite. Slight movement. And one goes to the Lord and one goes Lazazel. So too in life, it's often the case that a word, a kind gesture, a simple show of concern can make the whole difference. I think I've mentioned to you that of late, when I've had the opportunity before COVID to give classes around the country, when I'm so honored, when I'm often not worthy of it, but somebody would come up to me and say, Avi, you were once my teacher at Stern College, at wherever it was, at Choveve, at Marat, and you said something that made the whole difference. And years ago, when I would hear that, my chest would be pumped. I say, oh, wow, I said something that made a difference. Now I tell you, when I hear that, my heart drops because I offer a prayer. Oh God, I pray that the word that I said had a positive effect and not a negative effect. That, by the way, was my mommy, my Ima. Very, very, very careful with each word. There are big action people and small action people. Every word, every movement can make the difference. There's a beautiful anecdotal story about a rabbi who asked his students, how far is Mizrach, wie weit is Mizrach zu Mariv? How far is east to west? So one student said, oh, from Israel to New York. The other one says, nah, from New York to California. The other one says, no, it's from the ark on the eastern side of the sanctuary to the back of the sanctuary, which is on the west. And the Rebbe said, name mein kid, know my children, nor ein klein dreh. One little turn. And from facing east, you're facing west. Slight movement of those lotteries can make the whole difference. Sending one either to God or sending one over the cliff, Lazazel. We've experienced this during COVID. What's counted the most? Phone call, hello, how are you doing? There's a young man in our synagogue, he keeps calling me. It's so beautiful. It really lifts me. Richie Langer, Ruby's, and Stanley Shalom Ruby, Tibadli L'chaim Ukim. So Richie once called me and he said to me, how are you doing? I said, I'm doing fine. I said, how can I help you? He said, oh, you really can't help me. I'm just going to see how you're doing. I'm just going to tell you, by the way, everything's good with me. I found that very interesting. Every once in a while, Richie still calls and says, everything's good with me. Don't worry about it. Most of the time when rabbis get calls, it's about this is wrong, that's wrong. And sometimes the small word, what's the song? I just called to say I love you, goes a long way. The small, small, small gesture. I'll take it one more step. So we'll finish the sixth piece and then we'll finish the last four. What happens now is that the Kohen Gadol, let me review, he's in his white clothes, he had put his hand on the bowl, recited an atonement for his family and himself, had gone to the other side, and he goes to the other side, and when he goes to the other side, he does the lottery. Then he comes back to the bull, and right before he slaughters the bull, he atones, as we pointed out already, not only for himself and his family, but for all of the priests. Now, the Talmud spends a long time on this. Exactly what is he atoning for? The Talmud says he's atoning because he was matame, that which was hekdesh. He made impure possibly that which was holy. And I think more broadly and spiritually, it could refer to perhaps insults that he was involved with against a fellow person, because at its core, all people are holy. And as the Kohen is asking for forgiveness, he cites the sentence of Ki vayom hazeh yechaper alechem, because on this day, God is going to forgive us. And he says God's name. The sentence ends with Lifnei Hashem. And as he says God's name, he's on the western side of the courtyard. The people on the eastern side, when they hear God's name, they're so overwhelmed, they prostrate and they fall to the ground. And let's take a look at what the text says. And this is the first time we're falling to the ground. V'hakohanim v'ha'am, and the priests and the people, hoyu korim u'mishtachavim, they bowed and prostrated themselves. In our synagogue, not only men, but women do this, offering thanks, and they fell upon their faces and they said, blessed is the name, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Liolam Voed. And sort of they were apart by a good number of feet. The high priest was over the bull, they were on the other end. And as the high priest atones with the name of God, let's visualize this, everyone else is falling to the ground. And the high priest, when he quotes that sentence that includes the name of God, invoking God's name to excuse the people, he lengthens out like a tekiah gadol, the name of God, until the worshipers completed their response. They sort of end at the same moment. And at that point, the Omer Lohem, at that point, the high priest turns to the people and he says, Tit Haru, you will be purified. I find this so meaningful because here, what's happening? The Kohen Gadol at this point is seeking atonement and purification for himself and for the whole priestly clan. And yet, when the people fall to the ground, what does the Kohen Gadol say? The Kohen Gadol says, you will be purified. Let's think about this for a moment. What should he be saying? He's seeking his own atonement. He should be saying, I will be purified. My fellow Kohanim and their families will be purified. That's not what he says. When the people fall to the ground, he says, I bless you, may you be purified. This is a fundamental spiritual message. It teaches that the pathway to self-purification is purifying others. More generally and counterintuitively, open your hearts. This is so important. In moments of greatest need, one ought step back seeking the welfare of others. The rabbis say this in Baba Kama, Kol hamipalel b'yad chavero hu nene tchila. Whoever prays for an other, his or her prayers are answered first. And this is not a gimmick. It's not that, okay, because I did this good thing, I'm going to be blessed. No, when praying for the other, it does something to my soul. It lifts my soul. By channeling concern away from the self towards the other, we are emotionally and spiritually uplifted. It's very counterintuitive. What we're arguing is that the pathway to feeling uplifted is showing gratitude and blessing the other. Yesterday, I saw a young man really struggling in life. And he said, and he came to this realization himself, I'm too self-focused. I have to move away from that. The more self-focused I am, he said, somehow within my soul, I feel more conflict. I have to move away and focus on others. Through the focus on others, I am lifted. I think I've mentioned this to you, and I want to mention my dear friend, Evan Spear, who sometimes is on with us, who now has gone through a third cancer operation. God should be with him, a young man. I remember when being wheeled in for my most recent stenting right before COVID, very serious. It turned out to be a very serious stenting. And thank God I had the wherewithal at that point to think about people who need a refuah shlema, moving it off a self-focus. If I look at my day, and it's only a day when I've kind of serviced myself, I think something's wrong. The best way to serve self is to serve others. You know, when we look at America, everybody talks about my rights. If you look at the 613 commandments, not one deals with the rights of a Jew. It deals with the obligations of a Jew. Obligations sometimes to self, most of the time to God and to others. It's through the obligations that the rights, that the benefits come. And it's a very major teaching that the Kohen at that moment, when they fall to the ground, he says to them, Tit haru. He's seeking self-atonement. And what does he say, Rabbi Eric? You will be cleansed. That's the rabbinate. What a gift. What a gift it is to be a rabbi. What do I do? Not much. Get up in the morning. You take care of yourself, but try to seek out the welfare of others. What most of you, what almost all of you are constantly doing. And frankly, with that, most of the service at that point, the unique service, pretty much comes to an end. What he does at that point is after that purification, what he does is he takes actually this is the seventh step. I said I'd stop after the 6, I'll stop after 7. What he does, the Kohen, is he then walks on top of the altar. The altar actually had a very long ramp, and the altar itself was like a little infield, lahavdil. And he takes coal, and he brings the coal down, and then he's given incense. It's very complicated in the Talmud, but I'm not interested in the complexities. I'm interested in he walks into the Holy of Holies with the embers, with the coal, and puts the coal down right in front of the Holy Temple, in front of the Holy Ark, which is in the Holy of Holies. And on top of the embers, the Karav Labadim, he drew close to the Ark's poles. The incense he placed between them, he places the incense on the coal and caused them to rise and smoke. The whole inside was full of smoke as he places the incense on top of the coals. So I want to leave you with this, that while the Avodah demands meticulous observance, and when you read it, it casts the aura of being cold and even distant. The incense, spiritually, it's like a music. It reflects something very different. Not a stern God, but it reflects, as the incense rises, a loving God whose Torah, encased in the ark, is a loving Torah. As the Proverbs say, Dracheha darchi noam, its ways are ways of pleasantness, v'chol netivoteha shalom. In a word, the incense represents the sweetness. It's a softening and setting the tone of whatever is going to follow. And I've mentioned to you, God willing, the end of the year, I hope this manuscript called Loving Torah, it's a commentary on the Bible, will be published. In Hebrew, Torat Ahava. And I love that title, Loving Torah, because that my brother Davi suggested, loving is not only a verb that I love the Torah, but it's an adjective describing God's Torah as loving. And we need that. And that's what the Avodah is all about. And that's why I think the Avodah, that's why the incense is placed before the ark. On top of the ark were the kruvim. The kruvim had wings, symbolizing intimacy, spousal intimacy. But spousal intimacy, as we know, could be finite. There could be marriage, and the marriage could be terminated. But in the same breath, above the wings were the childlike faces. The figures had childlike faces. They represent a different love. It's the love of a parent. God as if you will, as a parent, loving a child. The whole Torah is meant to be not what is described by many as an Old Testament that is rigid, that is fearsome. No, it's a loving Torah. The Torah in Judaism is a love story. That's why after slaughtering the bull, what does he do? He slaughters the bull, and then he goes inside and he offers the incense. And I'll take the liberty to go through the eighth and really stop then for your comments. What he then does is he goes out. It's complex, but he takes blood. The blood is in a vessel. First, the blood of the bull, then the blood of the goat, and it's complicated the way this is done. And he goes into the Holy of Holies a second time. So let's review. He has gone in with the incense. That's the loving Torah, so that this whole avodah be in the framework of love. Then he goes out and he takes the blood of the bull. And soon after, he's going to take the blood of the goat, because the goat that's supposed to be sacrificed to God is brought to him, and he sacrifices it. And he takes that blood and he sprinkles it on the ark. And this is the way he sprinkles it. In the Holy of Holies, the high priest sprinkles the blood of the bull and then of the goat, which he had just sacrificed, 8 times towards the ark. Look at my hands. The first, he takes the blood in this stance and he kind of sprinkles it up, and it goes in an arc, and it comes down right in front of the Aron, in front of the Holy Ark. And the first movement is an upward movement. Then he turns his hands over like this. You see my hands, takes the blood and throws it, sprinkles it gently, gently downward. And all of the 8 sprinkles, one is this way, the other 7 is this way, fall to the ground, each one coming closer and closer to the high priest. And as this priest sprinkles the blood, this is what he says. He calls out, I can see my father in the Avodah saying this. He says, Achat, achat biachat. Takes it this way, one. Then he turns his hand over. One and one. One and two. One and three. Some of you may recall it from the Avodah. Achat, then achat, ve'achat. Let's take a look at it on the screen. The liturgy describes the sprinkling. The kach hayomone, he sprinkled with the count. Rum malo achat, one upper sprinkling. Umato sheva, and 7 lower ones. And he counted 1 when he sprinkled up, turning his hands over 7 times. 1 and 1, 1 and 2, 1 and 7. And one wonders, the Talmud wonders, why does the high priest, when turning his hands, always mention the 1, the upward sprinkling first? What is that about? Why doesn't he say 1, then turn his hands over, and then 1, 2, 3? Why does he always proceed it with 1 and 1, 1 and 2? Maybe it could be suggested that on a spiritual plane, while there are down moments, that's what sprinkling down represents, one must never forget the upward moments, the uplifting, positive blessings that have been bestowed upon us. What we're arguing, and this is a spiritual move, that the upward sprinkling represents the highs that we feel in life. The downward sprinkling represents our challenges. And there's a difference between dream and reality. Dream is a dream, often it's perfection, the dream, the hope. But when reality sets in, there are bumps. And so what happens when disappointment sets in? We dream of a perfect marriage. We dream of an Israel that's perfect. But when you get there, it's not so perfect. I'd like to argue that when we face those bumps and disappointments, the way we get through is we never forget the dream. You never forget it's not just 1 and 2, but it's 1 and 1, 1 and 2. And in this vein, every morning, I recite the following reflection, especially during COVID. Yididi ahuvi mahmad nafshi, ana azor li lehodot lecha, al kol habrachot she'enakta li, velo latet et libi, al brachot shechaserot li. My beloved friend, O God, delight of my soul, please help me give thanks for all the blessings you have bestowed upon me, not allowing my heart to be weighed down by the blessings I lack. Now, that's the sprinkling, and there'll be other sprinklings. He's going to go back and he's going to sprinkle the blood of the bull and the goat on the curtain that divides the Heichal, the holy sanctuary, from the Holy of Holies. He's going to mix the blood. It's complex. Sprinkle it on the Mizbeach 7 times and on its corners 4 times. And then he's going to go to the other side of the courtyard. It's complicated. And he's going to send the goat. He's going to send it into the desert. And as it's sent, he's going to read the Torah in the Ezrat Nashim. And with that, the major Avodah service is completed. And he's going to go upstairs again, and he's going to change after immersing himself. He's going to change into his 8 golden garments, because he's going to perform the daily service again. And we'll pick up the last 2 pieces in a few moments. But I want to hear how you're doing. We have a little bit more time because Ezra's not teaching today. So I just have about 5-7 minutes more. But I want to hear what you feel about this type of approach. Yes, Tova. Tova, please. Please unmute yourself, Tova.
I have something to say about several things that you said. The first was, when you spoke about the distance, become close to God, but we don't touch him. We don't quite get there. And of course, Michelangelo depicted that in his art in the ceiling. And
yes, I appreciate that very much. It's a very, very, Tova, very powerful image in love. And I think it's saying that no matter how close, even how intimate we could be with someone we deeply love, in the end, there is a space. And that space, I think, enhances the intimacy. It's sort of like there are nerve ends, and the nerves are kind of at each other. And yes, although I would add, as we've discussed many times, Tober, that for Michelangelo, it's, I think, the hand or the finger which creates the human being. Am I right? Whereas in the Torah, it's not the finger that creates Adam's life, from whom Adam is both male and female, but it's the breath of God, the blowing of breath. It's even more intimate. Breath is of course much more, it's a different level. Yes, Toba.
But when we reach first with a full arm and a full hand.
Yes, we do.
And then we stretch out with the finger. If I could just.
Yes.
If I could.
Yes. I was thinking, I did a piece, I hope it will be posted somewhere, about that during COVID. I think about my parents, that there's an expression in the Bible of patoach tiftach, the open hand that gives. The open hand that gives, which is, I think, a centerpiece of love. Love is giving. But the contrast to that is the closing hand. I don't mean the closed hand,
right,
which is closed off from everyone, but the closing. And that's the art of graciously receiving. It's an art. I always thought that what's most difficult is giving in love. I think being able to receive is a real art, the vulnerability that one feels.
We're not always,
the dependency, yeah.
We're not always aware that we're receiving the love. No.
I appreciate that. That's so right.
And then when you spoke about the high priest changing from gold, his regular garments, to the white, I'd like to suggest that he's changing into his tachrichim.
Beautiful.
Because
you've moved me very much, Tova, as usual. I love that. Tova's saying tachrichim are shrouds.
And I think by doing that, he's acknowledging the temporary nature of life.
I love that.
He washes afterwards because
I love that.
Because he has gone through the preparation of the chevra when he put them on.
I love that.
On the tachrichim.
If I ever get this published, I'm gonna, with your permission, I want to quote that in your name. It's a beautiful thought. It's a beautiful thought. When you think about Yom Kippur, it's a simulation of death. We don't eat, we don't drink, we're not supposed to wash. Intimacy is prohibited. It's almost like we're having a brush with death. We wear white. And maybe the idea is that in that brush with death, we should come to appreciate every moment of life, never take it for granted. But I love that movement, wearing it. It's the ultimate humility. It's the ultimate humility. And then he again has to immerse. It's the cleansing. It's the tahara. It's the purification. Beautiful. Anybody else have a comment? Please. Eric, do you see anyone? I'll spend another
Rebbe.
10 minutes.
Hi, Rebbe,
Yes.
Can you hear me? It's Alyssa.
Hi, Alyssa. How are you doing, Rebbe?
Hi.
Great to
Thank
hear your
God,
voice.
my Rebbe. Great to hear your voice, too.
Thank you.
I just want to tell you, I can never tell you often enough, but you are just so much of a part of my heart and soul. And thank you for all your teaching.
Thank
And
you. It's very much in the reverse. It's reciprocal, Alyssa, and you'll always be a teacher of
you.
mine. And let it be. And your son, Fishel, he davened so beautifully, Shacharit, and Yitzhak Raphael is always my Yitzhak Raphael. Always be special to me.
Oh, thank
There are two
you.
more pieces that I
Thank
want to. There are two more pieces that I want to discuss. So at this point, the Kohen Gadol, he dons his golden garments and he performs other parts of the service, burnt offerings, and he begins the additional sacrifice. And then, believe it or not, after this short recess doing this more daily service, he again goes upstairs into the Paravat chamber and he again immerses, washes his hands and feet, and again gets into his white garments because he's got one more thing to do. Anybody? Do you know what he has to do? He has to take the shovel and the pan, the remains of the incense, out of the Holy of Holies. And let's take a look at it the way it's mentioned in the liturgy. V'nichnas ladvir, he entered the Holy of Holies. Tchunat klei ketoret, the vessels used for incense, hotzi, he removed. That's all he did. So one wonders why the removal constitutes a distinct service. When you think about it, why weren't these objects? He had the coal in the shovel, and he had the incense was in some kind of vessel. A lot of discussion of exactly what it was. And he had left the Holy of Holies to do the rest of the service, the sprinkling and what have you. But you wondered, would have been nothing for him to take these two pieces out. Why weren't these objects removed when he was previously leaving the Holy of Holies? Why is this a distinct part of the service? And perhaps we could suggest that maybe this was to accentuate the importance of how one says goodbye. How does one say goodbye? Goodbye to something or someone we love should be said haltingly and lovingly. After all, the Kohen Gadol is leaving the Holy of Holies. I've got to say goodbye in a loving way. And here, the Avodah may be teaching us, be very, very careful in how you say goodbye to a beautiful, beautiful moment. Be careful in the way you say goodbye to your loved ones. I didn't have a chance to say goodbye to my mother. As a matter of fact, to this day, I think I made a mistake. When I got to Israel, I was able, with the help of Els Bentime, she should be well, to fly out Motzei Yom Kippur. But when I came, I told my father, I don't believe that Ima died. And I went to Tanya, and I made the mistake. They actually, even though a Kohen, I could be near my mother. And they showed me my mother, and I have that image in my head. And my mother was such a beautiful woman inside and outside, but that image stays with me. I wasn't really able to say goodbye the way I wanted to. Although on Erev Shabbat, I did say, when Kippur then was Shabbat, I was able to say, I love you. When my father died, my father was not the kind of person who, he, from the Alta Haim, they didn't say I love you easily, but we were gathered around his bed, and he actually said to each of us, I love you. It's a powerful moment. And we, of course, said the same. And so that's what I think is being taught here. How does one say farewell? How does one say goodbye? I remember when our kids were much younger, Dina and Ilana and Dove, we used to sing Shalom Aleichem, and we greeted the angels on Shabbat, and they refused to sing Tzedchem V'Shalom. They didn't want to sing that the angels are leaving. And Dina used to say, we just welcome them. We're going to say goodbye to them. They refused to sing it. And I then read anecdotally that Rabbi Cook used to, in his Bekasha, he's a very saintly man, used to go to the door on Friday nights when he would sing Tzedchem L'Shalom, and he would wave bye-bye. Could you imagine? And when I mentioned this in synagogue, I hope maybe Daniela is listening. Daniela told me, I think that her mother taught her the following, that when she used to put Itai and Yishai, her little boys, now they're adults, very accomplished, when she used to put them on the bus to go to SAR, look at my hands, instead of waving bye-bye this way, she used to wave bye-bye, bye-bye, come back. And maybe, that's why there's a separate service to say farewell. Because even as we're leaving, what we're saying is, I love you. Come closer. And finally, Estelle, in just one moment, the last piece, what happens after this part, he then, believe it or not, he changes it back into his gold clothes, and he has to do the constancy, the daily afternoon sacrifice. And after he does that, he goes up again and he immerses himself and he puts away the golden and the white garments, and he puts on his everyday clothes. And his exit has sparks of a joyous wedding. And the Kohen Gadol appears as he comes out with a particular glow. And he feels an inner glow, but what do you do when you have and feel this inner glow? Immediately he turns outward and he offers prayers for the assembled. And let's take a look at the text. And he could say Tashemesh B'Gvura. The priest comes out with the appearance of his face was like the brilliance of the sun. And this was his prayer. B'kach hayat tfilato yiratzon lufanecha. Shetei Hashana Zot Shnat Bracha, let it be a year of blessing. And this is the point in our service where we break out with this melody that the great Rabbi Yehuda Amital in Yeshivat Har Etzion brought to the West. Emet ma neda, haya kohen gadol. And how truly glorious was the Kohen Gadol as he left the Holy of Holies. And is actually a discussion of he looked like a bridegroom, where the bride, he's the bridegroom, he comes out. What a glorious, glorious moment. It's almost like there's a chuppah and God is present and the high priest is present, bride and groom, and the people are celebrating. But what do we do at a wedding? At a wedding, what do we do at that very, very moment, at the most euphoric moment? We break a glass, reminding ourselves of the brokenness of the temples, the brokenness of human temples. This in sync with Jewish tradition, to recall and reach out to the most vulnerable during our most celebratory moments. And so, right after we sing Emet Ma Neda, we say, Avol Avonot Avotenu Hecharivu Maveh. But our past sins led to the destruction of the temple. And so we break a glass. And I think that this Yom Kippur, maybe as Yom Kippur ends with the Tekiah Gedolah, maybe we should break a glass, literally break a glass after Mariv, maybe, because we should remember, yeah, we're hopeful, but 4.5 million people died from COVID, 650,000 Americans, over 7,000 people in Israel. hundreds of thousands, their lives are economically, emotionally shattered forever and ever. We got to break the vessels. Break the vessels for Leah Golden, that her son Hadar Golden should come home safely. Break the vessels for the families of the 13 American soldiers who lost their lives in Kabul. Break the vessels for Surfside, for those not far from us who drowned in water from the Hurricane Ida. This is a moment, at the moment of euphoria. I learned this from my father, from my mother. They instilled within me, when things are going well, never ever forget the downtrodden. Always, always be there. But I'd like to argue that when we break the glass, and at a wedding, when we break the glass and we scream Mazel Tov, you wonder, what are we saying Mazel Tov? We just broke the glass because the temples or human temples were destroyed. Why in the world are we screaming Mazel Tov? And maybe it's because when we break the broken vessels, what we're really saying is, what bride and groom are saying, what we're saying is, may we be inspired to fix the broken vessels. In Luriana Kabbalah, this is called the tikkun of Shvirat HaKelim, the fixing, the repairing of the Avodah service. Now open your hearts for this final word. It was Rav Kook, and it's also, this thought is inspired by Shalom Alsky's the Dibuk. He says, when you think about the Avodah, that is a moment when the holiest of realms come together as one. After all, it occurs in the Holy of Holies. That's the holiest of places. Something happens. That's where the service occurs. And it's performed on that day by the holiest of individuals who's leading our ritual, the high priest. And it is, of course, the holiest of days on Yom Kippur. And on the holiest day, in the holiest of places, the Kohen Gadol, the holiest of persons, is articulating, is reciting the holiest of words, the name of God. I'll say it in a sentence. The Avodah is a synthesizing of the holiest of days, Yom Kippur, with the holiest of places, the Kodesh Kodashim, with the holiest of people, the Kohen Gadol, reciting the holiest of words, the Shem Hashem. But I'd like to offer this possibility. Could this be a formula for future redemption? When we think about the Avodah, the holy service, we're thinking about the past, what occurred in the past. Could it really be reflecting not only a memory of what was, but the hope of what will be? And so I offer the prayer, if only every day would be treated like the holiest day of the year. If only every place could be seen as the Holy of Holies. My home, my office, could it have the holiness, the importance of the Holy of Holies? If only every person would be viewed as the Kohen Gadol. Every person, my doorman or doorwoman, the person who slices my meat at a bar mitzvah or at a wedding or a bat mitzvah, the person who is my cashier. If only every person would be viewed as the Kohen Gadol. If only every word one recites would be as uplifting as reciting the name of God. If that could be, then the ultimate tikkun of redemption, the fixing of redemption, would take place. And I offer the prayer in my parents' memories and the memories of all of your beloved, for whom you'll be praying, whose souls will be with you this Yom Kippur. I offer the prayer of if only every day would be the holiest day, only every place would be treated as the Holy of Holies. If only every person would be viewed as the Kohen Gadol. If only every word would be as uplifting as reciting the name of God, the ultimate tikkun, fixing, redemption would be here. Lu Yehi, if only. So we have a few more minutes until 11:30, and we'll take your comments, please. Estelle, please.
When you were talking about saying goodbye, when we sent, like when my son was living in Israel, and we called him and said, it's time, you've got to come, because say goodbye to your father. And when he arrived in the plane, and Wilma met him at the airport, the minute he saw my daughter, he knew that he was too late. And there was no way that he could say goodbye there. But at Shloshim was one way of saying goodbye. And in addition, when Yom Kippur comes around, when my husband was around, it was the only way he could ever say goodbye to his own parents who were lost in the Holocaust. So this was the days before they established a separate day for Holocaust Survivor Day or whatever. But Yom Kippur was always a day to say goodbye. And although all the prayers and everything may be very well and good, but for us, it was always goodbye.
Yes.
So.
Yes. Thank you for sharing. Arnie, please.
Avi, I love, as usual, your message. And it makes total sense to me, but what about people who are so broken that they can understand it and agree with it at one level, but inside don't feel like they have the wherewithal to reach in the way that you're talking about?
Right. I fall into that category, Arnie, because I hardly reach what the Avodah aspires, as we concluded that we become. All what can do is do the best one can do, and Dayenu, that will be enough. When I think about you, Arnie, you are, for me, a hero. Arnie, you always were. You're faced with this difficult challenge, and notwithstanding, you really, I think, are a model of what we were talking about. The way that they say, you can say partial praise, so partial praise is permitted, but in the way you treat people, in the way everything about you, Arnie, all one can do is the best one can do. And Dayenu, not be hard on ourselves. It's a reach. Anyone who thinks that they've made it has not made it. It's all a process. The process is more than the attainment of the goal. And you've done that and more. Anybody else? Any thoughts? I really wanted to thank all of you, because we're just a day or two before Yom Kippur, and you never know who's going to get on. And this was a shiur that personally means a great deal to me, because it's my Ima and Abba, who mean so much to me, whose presence I feel, and that you found the time to share this time with me. I deeply, deeply, deeply appreciate and thank you for, and may this be a wonderful year. A year of blessings, a year of health, a year of life, a year of fulfillment, a year of keeping hopeful. Keeping hopeful. I'm fond of the Shimon Peres quote. I don't know if I've quoted it to you ever. that Perez was asked, how does he say when he hit 90, how do you say so youthful? He said, well, he said something like optimist and pessimist die the same way. They just live differently. And I prefer to live as an optimist, and easier said than done, but I like that. I like that a lot. So I love you, and I know I use the word love a lot, but I think we should use the word love more. We need it. And to all of you, Elaine, to you, just my blessings, to Judith, to Eric, thank you for all, Ezrazon and Alan and Linda, of course, and to all of you, to Tova, it's great to have you on board. And, I feel like saying to you, a penny for your thoughts, and Howard and Thea, everybody, Karen, and I see my Daniel, my Talmid Chacham Daniel, Carol's on, a whole bunch of numbers. I know that Shana Leah is on somewhere. And Rafi, just calling out your names that I can see, Carol, Ruth, and Karen Jordan's on. Remember your husband, Daniel, what a beautiful man. Give my best to Michael and Thea. I still remember the last four numbers of Thea's phone number, 1905. Wow, I have we used to remember numbers on you. Remember Jerry Lucas? He used to look at a phone book and he memorized the numbers. I can memorize one or two. Just to all of you, Harold, Carol, stay positive. Let every day be a full day. My Ruth, just, there are no words to thank you for who you are, what you are, and present, and thinking about Howard. And
Thank you.
yeah. My blessings, everybody. Shana Tova.
Thank
Let's
you
go
for
off
the
mute with each other. Shana Tova.
Have an easy fast.
Thank you. Natalie,
Shana
take care.
Tova.
Okay, Shana Tova.
Thank you.
Earthly pronouns, Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi.
Shana Tova.
Good to
Thank
listen
you,
to yours.
Rabbi. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
She
It was
moves
wonderful.
the boat.
Tova,
Here.
Shana Tova. Robert, Shana Tova. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
And that's okay.
Shana Tova. Shana Tova.
Jonah